In a town in the Sicilian hills called Corleone, the same name a novelist would later borrow to make the mafia sound noble, a group of men the city bosses laughed at and called peasants spent 20 years quietly preparing to do something no crime group had ever done. Not rob a bank, not run a city, wage open war on an entire country, and very nearly win. Most of what people think they know about the mafia comes from one film: sharp suits, loyalty, men who live by a code. That film was based on a true story, and it is a good film. But it is the American cousin of something far older and far colder that stayed behind on one island. And the real thing makes the movie look like a fairy tale told to children. This is the story of bombs that registered as earthquakes, of an investigation poisoned from the inside, and of a 12-year-old boy. And it is all true. Section 1. The movie and the real thing. Most of what people think they know about the mafia came from a screen, and a lot of it came from one film in particular. Goodfellas arrived in 1990, directed by Martin Scorsese, and it was built from a true story. It was based on a book called Wise Guy by the writer Nicholas Pileggi, which followed a real man named Henry Hill and the real circle of mobsters he ran with in New York. Hill eventually turned on those men, worked with the authorities, and spent the rest of his life under a new identity in a protection program. So the film is not pure invention, it is a true account, dressed up beautifully, of how that world actually felt from the inside. And that is exactly why it stuck. The movie makes the life look like the best party in town before it all comes apart. Sharp suits, stacks of cash, a table at the back of every restaurant. A tight group of men who treat each other like brothers and live by what they call a code. For most of the running time, being one of these guys looks like the most fun a person could possibly have. Plenty of people walked out of that film, not frightened of the mob, but quietly wishing they could be part of it. That feeling, that pull, is the myth this whole video is going to take apart. Because here is the gap nobody fills in. The men in that film are the American cousins of something far older, far larger, and far colder that grew up on the other side of the ocean, on a single island. The New York crews you see on screen came from families who had crossed over from Sicily generations earlier. They kept some of the rituals and some of the names, but they were a branch, not the root. The root stayed home. And the root was a different kind of thing entirely. The real organization in Sicily had a name its own members used among themselves. They called it Cosa Nostra, which means, roughly, our thing. It was not born in the 20th century, and it was not invented by Hollywood. It grew up in Sicily more than a century and a half ago, back in the 1800s, in the gap left behind when the island's old land system fell apart. From the start, it was never one single gang with one leader. It was dozens of separate local families, and each family owned a patch of ground the way a shop owns its corner. One controlled a town, another controlled a neighborhood inside a city, another controlled the farmland and the water that fed it. For about 100 years, the most important fact about this organization was a secret, and it was a secret hiding in plain sight. The secret was that all of these separate families were not really separate at all. They were one body. They shared the same rules, the same rituals, and the same loyalties. And above the individual families sat a ruling council that settled disputes and signed off on the biggest decisions. People came to call that council the Commission, or the Cupola, which simply means the dome. For decades, the Italian state and much of Sicilian society refused to admit any of this was real. Polite people insisted the mafia was just a word, a local attitude, a habit of keeping quiet, maybe a handful of unconnected criminals. The idea that it was a single, structured organization with a board of directors at the top was treated as an exaggeration or an insult aimed at all Sicilians. We only learned how the machine truly worked because one man on the inside finally chose to explain it. His name was Tommaso Buscetta, and he had spent his life as a member. After the organization turned on his own family and took several of his relatives from him, he broke the oldest rule of all and started talking. He sat down with an investigating magistrate named Giovanni Falcone and laid the whole structure out, family by family, rule by rule, all the way up to the commission. What Buscetta described became the foundation of the largest mafia trial in history. And it changed everything. Because for the first time, a court could treat Cosa Nostra as exactly what it was. One organization, responsible, as a body, for what its members did. The rules Buscetta described were strict, and they were for life. The first and most important was silence. Members lived by a code they called omertà, which meant you never spoke to the authorities about anything, ever, no matter what was done to you or the people you loved. To join, a recruit went through a ceremony. An older member would prick the new man's finger, smear the blood on the paper image of a saint, and set that image alight in his cupped hands. As the paper burned, the recruit swore to belong to the organization until he died, and to be reduced to ashes himself, like the saint, if he ever betrayed it. From that moment, he was what they proudly called a man of honor. Hold on to that phrase, because the whole point of this video lives inside it. Man of honor. It sounds noble. It sounds like a knight in an old story. The organization wanted it to sound that way, and the films built a fortune on letting it sound that way. But the cases coming up in this video will show you, one after another, just how hollow the word honor actually was for these men. They ended the lives of their own friends over a rumor. They went after the wives, the parents, and the children of people they wanted to punish. They turned on the very members who had served them most faithfully the moment those men became inconvenient. There was a code, yes. The code just had almost nothing to do with honor as a normal person understands the word. While all of this ran on fear, it was fed by money, and the money came from everywhere. The most basic stream was something called the pizzo, which was protection money. The organization squeezed a regular payment out of shops, builders, restaurants, market stalls, almost any business that wanted to keep operating. The deal was simple and ugly. Pay, and nothing happens to you. Refuse, and your shop is wrecked, set alight, or worse. In the worst years, by some estimates, around 80 out of every 100 businesses in parts of Sicily were paying, and investigators later guessed that in the Palermo area alone, the protection racket was pulling in something like 160 million euros every single year. On top of that came control of public building contracts, so that public money meant to build roads and schools quietly flowed through their hands. And then came the stream that made them rich beyond anything a street gang could dream of. They moved into the international narcotics trade, running an illegal product across continents in deals worth well over $1 billion. That kind of money buys more than cars and houses. It buys judges, it buys officials, it buys silence on an industrial scale. This is where the distance from the movie becomes impossible to ignore. In the film, the New York crews mostly prey on their own corner of the world. They hijack trucks, rob an airport, lean on local businesses, and turn on each other when the pressure builds. It is grubby and it is dangerous, but it stays, more or less, inside the underworld. The Sicilian organization aimed much, much higher. When the state finally came after it in earnest, Cosa Nostra did not run, and it did not just defend itself. It went on the offensive against the country itself. Over the years, it set out to remove the people the state sent to stop it: investigating magistrates, police commanders, prosecutors. A senior army general sent specifically to break them, politicians who turned against them. These were not rival criminals. They were public servants doing their jobs, and the organization treated ending their lives as a normal tool of business. It also reached straight into the machinery of government. In parts of Sicily, the families could deliver whole blocks of votes at election time, which made them useful to ambitious politicians and gave them friends in high places in return. For long stretches and across wide areas of the island, The organization was not hiding from the law. It was, in practice, stronger than the law. It collected its taxes, settled its disputes, handed out its punishments, and ran its own kind of shadow government, while the official one looked away. A street gang wants to get rich and stay out of jail. This was something closer to a hidden state, with its own rules, its own courts, and its own armies, sitting on top of a real country and slowly strangling it. So come back to the movie one last time. The big shock at the end of Goodfellas, the moment that lands like a punch, is that one man betrays his friends to save his own skin. The film treats that betrayal as the unthinkable thing, the line you do not cross, the act that turns a brother into a marked man. And in that world, maybe it was. But hold the real Sicilian story up next to it, and something uncomfortable happens. The coldness, the readiness to turn on your own, the willingness to reach for a friend's family to make a point, the casual ending of lives over money and pride. None of that was the shocking finale. In Sicily, that was the everyday operating system. It was not the exception that broke the code. It was the code, which means the most disturbing crime in the film would barely register as a footnote in the real history. That is what the title of this video actually means, and it is worth being precise about it. Worse is not the same as scarier or more exciting. A film is a story with a shape. It builds, it peaks, it ends, and the lights come up, and you go home. The real thing did not end when the credits rolled. It left thousands of real people gone over the decades, real families shattered, real towns held in fear for 2 and 3 generations, and a wound in a real country that has still not fully closed. The movie gave us a fantasy with a beginning, a middle, and a clean end. The history gave us something with no clean end at all. Once you really look at it, the polished, almost fun version on screen starts to feel less like the truth and more like a costume the truth was wearing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But none of this happened all at once, and it was not always run by the cold strategists who would one day take on the state. For a long time, the organization was more local, more old-fashioned, almost sleepy by comparison. The thing that changed everything was the rise of a small group of outsiders from a single town in the Sicilian hills. Men the proud city families looked down on and called peasants, and badly underestimated. To understand how this hidden state grew teeth sharp enough to bite a whole country, we have to go meet them, and we have to start with the town they came from. Section 2. The peasants nobody feared. About 40 miles south of Palermo, high in the dry inland hills of Sicily, sits a small farming town called Corleone. Most people outside Sicily have heard that name without ever knowing where it comes from, because a novelist borrowed it. When Mario Puzo wrote The Godfather, the all-powerful crime family at the center of the story was given the surname Corleone, taken straight from this real place. The novel and the films that followed turned the word into a symbol of stately, old-fashioned mafia power, the kind run by a calm, gray-haired godfather who settles disputes in a quiet study and never raises a voice. The real Corleone produced nothing stately. The real Corleone produced the coldest and most violent group the Sicilian organization had ever known. And the story of how that happened is the story of how the whole thing turned into a weapon, aimed at an entire country. For most of the organization's long history, the real power lived in the city, not the hills. The grand families of Palermo controlled the docks, the markets, the building sites, and the smuggling routes, and the bosses of those city families thought of the work almost as a profession passed down through generations. There was a certain style to the old Palermo way of doing things. Influence was bought quietly. Officials were paid off rather than removed. Disputes were settled in private, and open violence was treated as a last resort, partly because too much blood in the streets was bad for business and brought unwanted attention. The Palermo bosses saw the men from the poor hill towns, and Corleone most of all, as backward country cousins who did not understand how a modern operation should be run. There were nicknames for the Corleone men, and every one of them was an insult. One nickname translated roughly as the peasants. Another translated as the muddy feet. The message behind the words was simple. The men from Corleone were not serious people, and nobody in Palermo needed to worry about a handful of farmers with weapons. That contempt turned out to be one of the most expensive mistakes in the organization's history. For years, the boss of Corleone was a man named Michele Navarra. Navarra was a physician, a real doctor with a real practice, and across the district carried the respectable title of a man of medicine. Beneath the respectable surface, Navarra was the figure who truly controlled the town, the water, the land deals, and the local jobs. Under Navarra worked a young, restless, and exceptionally dangerous member named Luciano Leggio. Leggio had come up through the rough agricultural world of cattle and stolen livestock, and had shown from an early age a willingness to use violence faster and more freely than the men above. Tension grew between the careful old doctor and the ambitious young enforcer, and in the end, only one of the two could remain standing. On the 6th of August 1958, a group of armed men ambushed Michele Navarra on the orders of Luciano Leggio and ended the old boss on the road. Leggio, then around 33 years old, took control of Corleone. What followed was not the end of the violence, but the beginning of it. The men who had carried out the work for Leggio, and who would carry out far more in the decades ahead, were three young members from Corleone whose names would eventually be known across the world: Salvatore Riina, Calogero Bagarella, and Bernardo Provenzano. Over the years after the doctor was removed, this group methodically tracked down the supporters who had stayed loyal to Navarra and did away with dozens of them, one after another, until almost no one was left who might one day seek revenge. Corleone, a town most Italians could not have found on a map, was being turned into a training ground for a new and merciless way of operating. Salvatore Riina was the central figure. Short and stocky, Riina was given a nickname in the local dialect that meant, more or less, the short one, a name that sounded almost affectionate and hid what was underneath. A grimmer nickname attached itself later, one that translated as the Beast. Bernardo Provenzano, the quieter of the pair, earned a nickname that translated as the Tractor, because of a reputation for flattening anyone unlucky enough to stand in the way. In later years, Provenzano would gain a second reputation as a careful, patient manager, the kind of figure who preferred to run things from the shadows with paperwork and arrangements rather than open force. But the early years were built on raw violence all the same. Above the pair stood Leggio, and the descriptions left behind by other members are chilling in their simplicity. One mafioso who later turned against the organization, Antonino Calderone, described Leggio as a man who simply enjoyed ending lives, with a stare cold enough to frighten even hardened criminals who thought nothing could frighten them. What made the Corleone men so dangerous was not only the appetite for violence. The truly important thing was how that violence was aimed, and what rules went out the window. The old Palermo bosses still pretended, at least, to follow a set of limits. Certain people were supposedly off limits. Certain lines were not crossed. The Corleonesi, the name that came to describe Riina, Provenzano, and the growing web of allies around them, treated those limits as weaknesses to be exploited. Riina was willing to go after the families of enemies. Riina was willing to harm women and even children, in a world that had long claimed such things were forbidden. Riina was even willing to end the lives of ordinary members of the public who had nothing to do with anything, simply to spread confusion and pull the authorities in the wrong direction. None of this was carelessness. All of it was strategy, and the strategy worked because the enemy could never quite believe how far the men from Corleone were prepared to go. There was also a cruel kind of luck built into the Corleone position. While the proud Palermo families were known to the police, settled in the city, and wrapped up in the bribery and the polite arrangements that made the established bosses easy to watch, Riina chose a different life. From the late 1960s onward, Riina lived as a fugitive, hidden, hard to find, and almost impossible to pin down. When the law cracked down, the crackdowns tended to fall on the visible, comfortable city chiefs who had grown soft and reachable, while the hidden hillmen slipped through. Every time an old Palermo boss was arrested or removed, a little more space opened up, and the Corleonesi quietly moved into it. Before vanishing into hiding, Riina had already learned how little the courts could touch the organization when fear did the work. Riina and Leggio were put on trial in 1969 for a series of earlier killings. The case collapsed. Witnesses changed stories or went silent. Jurors understood very well what could happen to anyone who convicted the wrong men, and in the end both walked free. The lesson was burned in. A trial was not a wall. A trial was an obstacle that fear could knock down. Soon after that acquittal, Riina was charged again over another death and chose to disappear rather than risk a courtroom a second time. The disappearance lasted more than 23 years. For over 2 decades, one of the most wanted figures in Italy lived as a ghost, often not far from Palermo at all, running an empire while officially nowhere to be found. Leggio's luck ran out sooner. After years on the run, Luciano Leggio was finally captured in the northern Italian city of Milan on the 16th of May 1974, and the following year was handed a sentence of imprisonment for life. On paper, Leggio remained the head of the Corleone clan, but a boss behind bars can only do so much. In practice, real command passed to Salvatore Riina, with Bernardo Provenzano at the right hand. By the end of the 1970s, Riina controlled the Corleonesi outright, and the small group of muddy feet from the hills was no longer a joke whispered about in Palermo. The group had become something the city bosses should have been watching very closely. Most of them were not. The next move was patient and clever, and it showed that the Corleonesi were far more than simple brutes. Across the wider organization, there was a governing council, re-established in 1970, often called the Commission or the Cupola, made up of the most powerful bosses, who were supposed to keep order and approve the biggest decisions. Among the leading figures of that council in the early years were Stefano Bontade and Gaetano Badalamenti, both representing powerful Palermo interests, while the Corleone seat was held in the name of the imprisoned Leggio and spoken for by Riina. On the surface, the Corleonesi were simply one voice among several. Underneath the surface, Riina and Provenzano were building something the rules of the organization strictly forbade. The pair were secretly recruiting allies inside other families, members who would keep loyalty to the Corleonesi hidden from their own bosses, creating a private network that cut straight across the official structure. It was, in effect, a secret organization growing inside the real one like a parasite. Several powerful men quietly threw in with the Corleonesi while pretending to remain neutral. Among the hidden allies were Giuseppe Calò, a boss connected to the Portanuova family, Filippo Marchese, who controlled a tough Palermo district, and Rosario Riccobono, another Palermo figure. Most important of all was Michele Greco, a boss from the Ciaculli area on the edge of Palermo, a man with a respectable manner and a churchy nickname that earned the title the Pope. Greco played the role of a calm, neutral peacemaker, the kind of figure the old families trusted to keep the council balanced. In reality, Greco was aligned with Riina, and that secret alliance would prove deadly because it placed a Corleone ally at the very heart of the council the old families believed protected them. With the pieces quietly in place, the Corleonesi began to tilt the council in the chosen direction. In 1978, the network engineered the removal of Gaetano Badalamenti from the commission, pushing out one of the leading old guard voices, and Michele Greco stepped into the empty seat. To anyone watching from outside, it looked like ordinary internal politics. To the men who understood what was really happening, it marked the end of an old balance and the beginning of a takeover. The same year, the Corleonesi arranged the removal of 2 important bosses from outside Palermo, Giuseppe Di Cristina and Giuseppe Calderone, both of them allies of the old Palermo families. Each time an ally of the old guard was taken off the board, the powerful city bosses, Bontade and others like them, grew a little more isolated, a little more surrounded, a little more alone. The trap was closing, and the men inside it still did not fully understand that a trap existed. This is the part of the story the polished film version never tells, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. The popular image of the mafia is the wise old Don in the comfortable study, the dignified head of a proud family who values loyalty above everything. The reality that grew out of Corleone was the opposite of that picture in almost every way. The Corleonesi did not value the old loyalties. The Corleonesi used those loyalties as bait. The strength of the men from Corleone was not honor or tradition or restraint. The strength was a total willingness to break every rule the organization claimed to live by, combined with the patience to do it slowly enough that the victims never saw the full shape of the plan until far too late. The proud city aristocrats of crime, who had spent years sneering at the peasants with the muddy feet, had let those peasants take a seat at the table, build a secret army across the families, and slip a loyal ally into the very council meant to keep everyone safe. By the dawn of the 1980s, the muddy feet from the hills were no longer climbing toward power. The Corleonesi had nearly reached the top, and had done it quietly, through patience, secrecy, and a readiness to do things the old families considered unthinkable. What remained were the proud old bosses of Palermo, men like Stefano Bontade, who still believed the organization belonged to the city and that the council still worked the old way. Those men were about to discover, all at once, and far too late, exactly what the peasants from Corleone had been preparing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What came next was not a series of scattered arguments or the usual quiet removals that the organization had always lived with. What came next was an all-out slaughter, planned in advance and aimed at wiping the old Palermo families off the face of the earth. And over the course of it, the streets of Palermo would see something close to one death every single day. Section 3. The Slaughter. The killing that opened the war happened on a spring evening, and it happened to a man who should have seen it coming and did not. On the 23rd of April 1981, Stefano Bontade was driving home through Palermo after celebrating his 42nd birthday. Bontade was one of the grandest bosses the city had, the head of a powerful family, a man with connections that reached up into politics and high society, known by the proud nickname the Prince. As the car slowed at a junction, gunmen opened fire with a military weapon, a type of assault rifle that would become the signature tool of everything that followed. Bontade, the untouchable prince of the Palermo organization, was gone before he understood what was happening, killed on the same day he had been born. 3 weeks later, it happened again. Salvatore Inzerillo, another major Palermo boss and a close ally of Bontade, was taken in almost exactly the same way, ambushed and ended with the same kind of weapon. Investigators later came to believe it was even the same physical rifle, passed from one job to the next like a tool on a building site. In the space of less than a month, the two strongest pillars of the old Palermo establishment had been knocked down. The message could not have been clearer. The men with the muddy feet, the peasants the city had laughed at, were not asking for a larger share anymore. The peasants were taking everything, and anyone who stood in the way was already a dead man whether they knew it yet or not. What made these two killings so shocking inside the organization was not only who the victims were, but the fact that the killings were never supposed to be possible. Under the old rules, no boss could be removed without the approval of the ruling council. A figure as important as Bontade or Inzerillo was protected by tradition, by alliances, by the simple understanding that touching such a man would bring the whole structure down on the heads of whoever dared. Riina broke that understanding completely. The secret network the Corleonesi had spent years building, the hidden allies planted inside other families, meant that when the moment came, the people who should have warned Bontade and Inzerillo, the people who should have protected them, were quietly working for the other side. The old bosses were surrounded by traitors and did not know it. By the time the shooting started, the war was already lost. What followed over the next 2 years has a name in Sicily. People came to call it the matanza, a word borrowed from the brutal mass slaughter of tuna fish that fishermen carried out in the waters around the island, where the sea would turn red. It was a fitting name. With Bontad and Inzerillo gone, the Corleonesi set out to wipe their families off the map entirely. The strategy was not to defeat rivals and let the survivors surrender. The strategy was extermination, root and branch, so that no one would be left alive to seek revenge in 5 or 10 or 20 years. Friends of the dead bosses were hunted down. Loyal members were lured to meetings that turned out to be traps. Relatives who had nothing to do with the organization's business were taken simply for sharing the wrong surname. The violence reached across the ocean. One of Inzerillo's brothers, who had fled all the way to the United States hoping distance would save him, was tracked down and ended on American soil. A relative of another old guard figure turned up dead in a field in Germany. There was, in the end, nowhere far enough to run. The numbers are hard to take in. Across the roughly 2 years of the worst fighting, estimates of the dead run as high as 1,000 people. In Palermo itself, in the worst stretches, the city was losing people at a rate that worked out to something close to 1 killing every single day. Bodies appeared in car boots, in ditches, on roadsides, in the streets in broad daylight. Many were never found at all, and that was deliberate, because the Corleonesi had perfected a particular method designed to leave nothing behind. A victim would be taken, ended, and then made to disappear completely. The body destroyed using strong acid or buried where no one would ever look. In the local dialect, this had a chillingly gentle name. It translated as the white shotgun, a way of describing a killing that left no corpse, no funeral, no proof, and no answers for the families left waiting. A wife might spend the rest of a lifetime never knowing for certain whether a husband was alive or dead. That uncertainty was not an accident. It was part of the punishment and part of the terror. The man who carried out a huge share of this work became one of the most feared figures the organization ever produced. Giuseppe Greco, usually known by a nickname that translated roughly as Little Shoe, was the chief enforcer for Riina during these years, the head of a death squad that operated across Palermo. Greco was not related in any close way to Michele Greco, the so-called Pope, but worked at Riina's direction, and the count of lives attributed to this one man is staggering. Investigators and former members later estimated that Giuseppe Greco was personally responsible for around 80 killings, possibly more. Greco was the kind of figure who could carry out the most appalling acts without any visible reaction, a young man who treated ending a life the way an ordinary worker treats a daily task. Around Greco worked a small group of equally cold specialists, men whose names came up again and again in later confessions as the hands that did the worst of it. To understand just how far the organization had drifted from the gentlemanly image on the screen, it helps to look at one particular horror from these years, because it shows the method at its most inhuman. There was a place in Palermo that later confessions described as a kind of slaughter room, a location controlled by Filippo Marchese, one of the Corleonesi allies. Victims were brought there, ended, and then dissolved in acid so that nothing remained. Former members who eventually spoke to the authorities described the place in terms that are difficult to read, a site where people were taken apart and erased as a matter of routine. This was not the work of a few unhinged individuals acting alone. It was an organized, deliberate system for making human beings vanish, run by an organization that still, to this day, gets dressed up in films as a brotherhood of honor. There is one detail about the Matanza that exposes the lie of the code more sharply than almost anything else, and it concerns how the Corleonesi treated the very men who did their killing for them. The expectation, the thing the organization always claimed to value, was loyalty. Serve faithfully, and the family protects. But Riina did not operate that way. Once the worst of the war was won, and the old families had been crushed, Riina turned on the loyal enforcers who had done the dirty work. The reasoning was cold and simple. Men who had killed dozens of people knew too much, and men who had become powerful and feared might one day become rivals. So they were removed in turn. The fearsome Giuseppe Greco, the death squad leader with around 80 lives behind him, the most loyal hand Riina had, was himself lured to a meeting and ended on Riina's orders. Other top killers from the same group met the same fate in the years that followed. The lesson buried in this is hard to escape. Inside the real organization, loyalty did not buy safety. Usefulness bought a little time, and when the usefulness ran out, so did the time. One former member summed up the whole bitter pattern in a way that has stuck ever since. Speaking later about how the Corleonesi operated, the man explained that Riina and the others first used the membership to get rid of the old bosses, and then got rid of everyone who raised a head and looked like they might amount to something, until all that was left were men with no real character, puppets who would never challenge anyone. That was the true shape of the new order. Not a proud family bound by tradition, but a single ruthless will at the top, surrounded by frightened followers who had watched what happened to anyone strong enough to be a threat. The slaughter also reached the family members of one particular man in a way that would, years later, come back to bring the whole organization terrible trouble. Tommaso Buscetta, a member of the old Palermo world and a friend of the murdered Bontade, was out of the country when the war broke out, having fled to South America sensing what was coming. Riina could not reach Buscetta directly, so Riina reached for the family instead. Over the course of the war, a long list of Buscetta's relatives were taken. 2 of his sons disappeared and were never found. A brother was ended. A son-in-law was ended. A brother-in-law and several nephews followed. The Corleonesi worked through Buscetta's family one by one, punishing a man they could not catch by destroying everyone connected to him. At the time, it must have felt like a victory. One more old guard figure broken and humiliated from a distance. It would prove to be one of the costliest decisions the organization ever made, though no one understood that yet. It is worth stepping back to take in what the Matanza actually achieved, because the scale of it changed the organization forever. Before the war, Cosa Nostra had been a collection of families with a council that, however violent its world could be, at least shared power among several strong groups. The big decisions needed broad agreement. No single man ruled everything. After the war, that was finished. The old Palermo families were destroyed or reduced to terrified silence. The council still existed on paper, but it had become a tool of one faction. The Corleonesi did not just win a larger share of the organization. The Corleonesi swallowed it. For the first time in the long history of the Sicilian organization, one man sat at the top of the entire structure with the power of life and death over everyone beneath. And that man was Salvatore Riina, the short fugitive from the hill town the city bosses had once laughed at. The way Riina ruled after the war earned the second nickname, the one that meant the beast, and the name fit the behavior. This was a leader who had learned a single overwhelming lesson from the climb to the top. Total ruthlessness worked. Breaking every rule worked. Going further than anyone expected, faster than anyone expected, against targets no one believed could be touched, worked every time. The restraint of the old Palermo bosses had been weakness. The willingness to do the unthinkable had been strength. Riina came out of the Matanza with that lesson burned into the bone, and it would shape every decision that came after, including the decisions that would eventually turn the organization's guns away from rival criminals and toward the state itself. For ordinary people in Sicily, the years of the Matanza were a nightmare that played out in plain sight. This was not hidden violence carried out quietly in the shadows. Bodies were turning up on city streets in daylight. Shootings happened at junctions and outside shops. Families learned to look away, to say nothing, to pretend they had seen nothing even when the truth was lying in the road in front of them. The code of silence, the omertà, was no longer just an internal rule for members. It had spread across whole neighborhoods as a matter of survival. To have seen something and to admit it was to invite the same fate. So the city learned to be blind. People walked past the aftermath of killings and kept walking. Shopkeepers paid the protection money and kept their mouths shut. An entire society was being trained, through fear, to accept that this was simply how life worked, and that the men doing the killing were beyond the reach of any law. And for a long stretch, that training held, because the state seemed unable or unwilling to do much about it. Investigations stalled, witnesses vanished or stayed silent. Cases fell apart in court, the same way Rehenna's own case had fallen apart back in 1969. The organization had spent a century making itself look like a fact of nature in Sicily, something as permanent and unchangeable as the weather. And the Matanza, for all its horror, had only tightened that grip. The Corleonesi had crushed every enemy inside the organization. The obvious question was whether anyone outside it would ever stand a real chance. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What the men from Corleone did not fully reckon with was that the river of blood they had created would eventually drive someone to break the oldest rule of all and tell the truth out loud. The relatives Riina had so casually destroyed, the friends turned to ash, the loyal killers betrayed in turn. All of it was building up a debt inside one broken survivor. And when that survivor finally decided to speak, the words would land in the hands of a single quiet magistrate from Palermo who actually knew how to listen. Section 4. The Man Who Broke the Silence. Tommaso Buscetta was not a small fish who got scared. That matters, because it is the whole reason what he did mattered so much. Buscetta was a serious figure inside the organization, a member since young adulthood, a man who had moved in the highest circles of the Palermo world for decades. Born in Palermo in 1928, he had grown up inside Cosa Nostra, taken the oath, lived by the rules, and built a life that stretched across continents. He smuggled, he trafficked, he moved between Italy, the United States, and South America with such ease that he earned a nickname that captured it perfectly. People called him the boss of two worlds, a man equally at home in the old country and the new. When a person like that finally decides to talk, it is not the panicked confession of a frightened nobody. It is an insider with a complete map of the organization choosing to hand that map to the enemy. For most of his life, Buscetta was the last man anyone would have expected to break. He believed in the old version of the organization, the version that supposedly lived by limits and tradition, the world of the Palermo families before the men from the hills tore it apart. In his own mind, Buscetta was a man of honor in the old sense, and he held a quiet contempt for what Riina and the Corleonesi had turned the organization into. But belief in the old code was not what made him talk. What made him talk was grief, and the grief came from the slaughter described in the last section. When the Matanza swept through Palermo, Buscetta was far away in South America, and Riina could not reach him. So Riina reached for everyone Buscetta loved instead. The list of what was taken from him is almost impossible to absorb. Over the course of the war, 2 of Buscetta's sons disappeared and were never seen again, almost certainly ended and erased, using the method that left no body behind. His brother was killed. His son-in-law was killed. A brother-in-law was killed. 4 of his nephews were killed. Person after person connected to him was wiped out, not because of anything any of them had done, but purely to punish a man the organization could not otherwise touch. By the time the worst of it was over, Buscetta had lost a large part of his family to the ambitions of the men from Corleone. The old rules he had believed in, the idea that the innocent and the uninvolved were protected, had been exposed as a comfortable lie. The organization he had served his whole life had murdered his children. In 1983, Buscetta was arrested in Brazil, where he had been living, and the Italian authorities began the process of bringing him back to face justice. He was extradited to Italy in 1984. At first, There was no sign at all that he intended to cooperate. In fact, when he arrived back in Italy, Buscetta tried to take his own life by swallowing a large quantity of poison, an attempt that failed. It was only after surviving that attempt, sitting in custody with his family destroyed and his old world in ruins, that Buscetta made the decision that would change Italian history. He asked to speak to one particular magistrate. He asked to speak to Giovanni Falcone. Giovanni Falcone was, in almost every way, the opposite of the men he spent his life hunting. Born in Palermo in 1939, Falcone had grown up in the same kind of neighborhood that produced mafiosi, had even known boys in childhood who later became members, but had taken the opposite path and become a prosecuting magistrate. By the early 1980s, Falcone had developed an approach to fighting the organization that was, at the time, genuinely new. Most investigators chased individual crimes, one killing at a time, trying to pin a single body on a single shooter. Falcone understood that this would never work against something the size and shape of Cosa Nostra. Instead, Falcone went after the money. He followed bank records, traced payments, mapped the flow of dirty cash across borders, and used the paper trail to reveal the organization as a single connected enterprise rather than a scatter of unrelated crimes. It was slow, unglamorous work, built on documents and patience, and it was effective in a way that frightened the organization badly. What made Falcone the right man to receive Buscetta's confession was not only the method, it was the way he listened. Falcone treated Buscetta not as a monster to be despised, but as a source to be understood, a man with knowledge worth more than gold, if only it could be drawn out carefully and recorded accurately. Falcone learned the organization's language, its rituals, its way of thinking, well enough that Buscetta could tell that the man across the table actually understood what he was being told. There is a remark Buscetta is said to have made to Falcone, a warning, early on. The meaning of it was that by choosing to listen and to write all this down, Falcone had signed his own death warrant, and that the state would not, in the end, be able to protect him. Both men understood the stakes. Both went ahead anyway. Over many sessions across the summer and into the months that followed in 1984, Buscetta laid out the organization from the inside in a way no one had ever done before. This was the moment the secret described in the first section finally came apart. Buscetta explained that Cosa Nostra was not a loose collection of separate gangs that happened to share a culture. It was one organization with a clear structure, built from local family units that each controlled a territory, with bosses, with underbosses, with soldiers, and with a ruling council, the commission, or cupola, sitting above the families to coordinate the most important decisions and approve the most serious killings. He described the initiation ceremony, the burning image of the saint, the oath taken for life. He described how the council worked, who sat on it, and how decisions were made and enforced. He named names, traced responsibilities, and connected the structure at the top to the violence on the streets. This insider account became the foundation of something that came to be known as the Buscetta theorem. The word theorem sounds like mathematics, and the comparison is fitting because the idea was as clean as a proof. If Cosa Nostra was genuinely a single, hierarchical organization in which the council approved the major killings, then the bosses who sat on that council were responsible for those killings even when other hands carried them out. A boss did not have to hold the weapon to be guilty. By approving the act, by sitting on the body that ordered it, the leadership bore the responsibility. This idea, drawn directly from Buscetta's description of how the organization actually functioned, meant that for the first time, the men at the very top could be held to account for the blood spilled far below them. It turned the organization's own structure into the evidence that could convict its leaders. It is hard to overstate how much resistance this idea met at first, and that resistance is part of the story. For about 100 years, large parts of Italian society, including parts of the legal world and the political class, had refused to accept that the organization even existed in this form. The comfortable position had always been that the mafia was a vague cultural thing, an attitude, a habit of silence. Certainly not a structured criminal corporation with a board of directors. Buscetta's testimony directly contradicted that comfortable position, and so a great many people questioned whether he could be believed. Some dismissed him as a bitter man inventing a grand conspiracy out of personal revenge. The defense lawyers, who would later face his testimony in court, worked hard to paint him exactly that way, as a vengeful fabricator dressing up his grudges as fact. The idea that one former boss could be telling the simple truth about something the establishment had denied for a century was, to many, harder to swallow than the denial had ever been. But Buscetta was not the only one, and that turned out to be the key. His decision to talk did not stay an isolated event. It cracked something open. After Buscetta began cooperating, another significant member, Salvatore Contorno, who had been an aide to the murdered Bontad, made the same choice and began telling the authorities what he knew. There is a moment from this period that captures the strange weight of what was happening. When Contorno first faced Buscetta, the story goes that Contorno, still bound by the old respect, treated the senior man with the deference of a soldier before an officer, and Buscetta, in effect, gave him permission to speak, telling him it was all right to talk now. The wall of omertà, the absolute silence that had protected the organization for a century, was not just being breached by one man. It was beginning to come apart, and each new voice made the next one a little more possible. The testimony of one former insider could be dismissed as a grudge. The testimony of several, lining up and confirming one another, was a great deal harder to wave away. The information Buscetta provided fed directly into the work Falcone and his colleagues were doing. Falcone was not working alone. He was part of a small team of magistrates in Palermo who had organized themselves into what became known as the Anti-Mafia Pool, a group that deliberately shared all the dangerous knowledge between them. The reason for this arrangement was grim and practical. In the years before, individual investigators who got too close had been killed one at a time, and each death had also killed the knowledge that person carried. By pooling everything, by making sure several magistrates held the same information and signed the same orders together, the team made itself harder to silence. Removing one of them would no longer erase the case, because the others would still hold all of it. The pool had been built on an idea created by an earlier magistrate, and that earlier figure had himself been killed by a bomb, which is a thread that will matter a great deal later. For now, the important point is that Buscetta's map of the organization did not sit in one vulnerable head. It was written down, copied, and shared across a team, and that made it survive. With Buscetta's account, Contorno's account, the financial trails Falcone had been building for years, and a mountain of other evidence, the pool assembled something unprecedented. The indictment that resulted ran to thousands of pages and laid out the case against hundreds of members of the organization, treating Cosa Nostra for the first time in a courtroom as the single structured body Buscetta had described. The careful work of listening, recording, and cross-checking had produced a document that did what no investigation had ever managed before. It made the invisible organization visible, on paper, in detail, in a form a court could actually act upon. The hidden thing that had hidden in plain sight for a century was finally written down where everyone could see it. There is a quiet irony at the heart of this whole turn of events, and it is worth naming because it goes straight back to the slaughter in the previous section. The Corleonesi, in their drive to destroy every rival and win total control, had murdered Buscetta's family in order to punish and humiliate a man they could not catch. At the time, it must have looked like just another act of dominance, one more old guard figure broken from a distance. But it was that very act, that destruction of his sons and his brother and his nephews, that pushed Buscetta past the point of loyalty and into the arms of the state. Riina's appetite for total victory had created the one thing total victory could not survive. A senior insider with nothing left to lose and a complete knowledge of the organization. The beast had been so thorough in his cruelty that he had manufactured his own greatest enemy. The willingness to break every rule, which had carried the Corleonesi to the top, had just planted the seed of their downfall. By choosing to speak, Buscetta had done something that went far beyond any single trial. He had broken the spell. For a century, the organization's greatest weapon had not been its weapons at all. It had been the silence, the omertà, the absolute certainty among members and ordinary citizens alike that no one would ever talk, that the organization was permanent, that resistance was pointless. Buscetta proved that the silence could be broken, that a man could walk out of that world and live long enough to testify, that the organization was not a fact of nature after all, but a thing built by human beings, and therefore something human beings could take apart. That proof was contagious, and the men at the top understood the danger of it perfectly well. An organization built on silence cannot survive too many people choosing to speak. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. All of it, the years of patient work, the confessions written down and cross-checked, the financial trails, the new legal theory that could reach the bosses at the top, was now pointing toward a single event. The state was preparing to put the entire organization on trial at once, in one room, in a way that had never been attempted anywhere in the world. To make it possible, they would build something extraordinary. A fortress of a courtroom designed to hold hundreds of the most dangerous men in Italy and to withstand anything the organization might throw at it. Section 5. The Bunker and the Cages. The problem the state faced in 1985 was a strange one, and it had never really come up before, because no one had ever tried to do what Palermo was about to do. Putting hundreds of dangerous members of the organization on trial in a single case meant finding a room big enough to hold all of them, plus their lawyers, plus the judges, plus the press and the public, plus enough security to make sure none of it ended in a massacre. No courthouse in Sicily, and arguably none in Italy, could do that. The defendants numbered in the hundreds, the lawyers numbered in the hundreds, and every one of those defendants was either a confirmed member of an organization that had spent years killing officials in broad daylight, or a man whose freedom depended on the trial collapsing. An ordinary courtroom was not just too small, it was a death trap waiting to happen. So the state built something new. Beside the old Ucciardone prison in Palermo, the authorities constructed a special courtroom designed for one purpose: to hold this trial and to survive it. People called it the bunker, and the name was earned. It was a vast structure of reinforced concrete, built to be strong enough, according to the descriptions of the time, to withstand even a missile strike. The walls were thick. The glass was bullet-resistant. The whole thing was connected directly to the prison next door, so that the most dangerous defendants could be brought straight from their cells into the courtroom without ever traveling through open streets where an ambush or an escape might happen. The speed of the build was almost as remarkable as the structure itself. A courtroom of that size and strength was put up in a matter of months, finished in well under a year, which by the normal pace of such things in Sicily was close to miraculous. The message of the building was as much about will as about concrete. The state was telling the organization, and telling the world, that this time it intended to follow through. Inside the bunker was the detail that gave the whole scene its unforgettable look, the detail that appeared in newspapers and on television screens around the world. Along the walls of the courtroom ran a long row of cages. They were holding cells with thick bars, more than 24 of them, built right into the room so that the defendants could be present for their own trial while kept securely apart from everyone else. Day after day, the most feared members of the Sicilian organization sat behind those bars while the case against them unfolded in the open space beyond. For an organization that had spent a century projecting an image of untouchable power, of men who moved freely and feared no one, the picture of dozens of them locked in cages in a state-built fortress was a humiliation in itself. The image did something the organization could not undo. It made the untouchable look caught. The trial that filled this bunker became known as the Maxi trial, a name that simply meant the maximum, the biggest, and it deserved the title. It began on the 10th of February 1986. The scale of it broke records and broke imaginations. The number of defendants facing charges came to 475. The charges covered an enormous range of crimes, from membership in the organization itself to many killings, to trafficking, to the protection rackets that squeezed the businesses of Palermo. The indictment that laid all this out ran to thousands of pages. Not every defendant was physically present, because a large number were fugitives being tried in their absence, including the most important fugitive of all, Salvatore Riina, the beast who still could not be found. But many of the biggest names the organization had were there in the room, in the cages, including bosses whose reputations had once made entire neighborhoods fall silent. Among the men in the cages was Michele Greco, the boss with the churchy nickname the Pope, the figure who had played the role of calm, neutral peacemaker on the ruling council while secretly serving the Corleonesi. There was Luciano Leggio, the old Corleone chief who had set the whole murderous machine in motion back in the 1950s before being locked away. There was Giuseppe Calò, a boss connected to the Porta Nuova family and one of the secret Corleonesi allies. The trial brought together, in one room, the human faces of the organization that for a century had insisted it did not even exist. And the simple fact of gathering them all in one place, under one set of charges, treated as members of one body, was itself the argument the entire case was built to prove. Holding a trial of this size was a nightmare of organization, quite apart from the danger. Finding a judge willing to take it on was difficult, because presiding over the Maxi trial was understood by everyone to be one of the most dangerous jobs in Italy. A series of judges found ways to avoid the assignment before one finally accepted it. A magistrate named Alfonso Giordano, who came mainly from a background in civil cases rather than criminal ones, and who, against the doubts of many, proved more than capable of steering the enormous proceeding through to the end. The court was not a single judge, but a panel that, in the Italian system of the time, combined professional judges with ordinary citizens serving in a role similar to a jury. Because the fear of intimidation was so real, a large number of reserve citizens were lined up in case any of the main ones were threatened or could not continue. Everything about the setup was shaped by the knowledge that the organization would do anything to make the trial fail. The early weeks were a grind. With hundreds of defendants and hundreds of lawyers, the proceeding was bogged down almost immediately in endless procedural arguments and delaying tactics, the kind of slow strangulation by paperwork and objection that could, if it went on long enough, drain the energy and the public faith out of the whole effort. Many observers began to wonder whether the Maxi trial would ever truly get moving, or whether it would collapse under its own weight before any real evidence was heard. The organization did not need to win in the cages if it could simply make the trial grind to a halt. Something was needed to break the logjam, a moment that would make the case real and undeniable. That moment arrived in the early days of April 1986, and it walked into the courtroom on its own 2 feet. Tommaso Buscetta came to testify in person. The boss of two worlds, the senior insider whose confession to Falcone had made the entire case possible, entered the bunker courtroom to face the men he was accusing. The accounts of that moment describe a heavy silence falling over the defendants as Buscetta took his place. This was the thing that was never supposed to happen. A real boss, a man of standing, breaking the oath of silence not in a quiet office, but openly, in front of the organization, under the eyes of the cameras and the court. Whatever the defense lawyers would try to say about him afterward, the simple sight of Buscetta testifying changed the atmosphere of the trial. It turned an avalanche of paperwork back into what it really was, a reckoning. The man who had broken the silence in private was now breaking it in public, where it could not be unheard. Buscetta's testimony, backed by the account of Salvatore Contorno and the mountain of financial and physical evidence the anti-mafia pool had assembled, did exactly what it was designed to do. It presented the organization to the court as a single structured body, with its families and its bosses and its ruling council, responsible as an organization for the crimes committed in its name. The defense fought it hard, trying to portray Buscetta as a liar, driven by revenge, a man inventing a vast conspiracy to settle private scores. But the testimony did not stand alone, and that was the strength of it. One voice could be called a grudge. Several voices, lining up and confirming the same structure, the same names, the same rules, supported by bank records and the patient work of years, formed a picture far harder to dismiss. The Buscetta theorem, the idea that the bosses at the top were responsible for what the organization did below them, was being tested in a real courtroom, and it was holding. The trial went on for nearly 2 years, an exhausting marathon of hundreds of hearings. Throughout all of it, the bunker held, the judge held, the citizens serving on the panel held, and the evidence kept coming. Then, on the 16th of December 1987, after the panel had spent more than a month deliberating, the verdicts were read out. The result was the heaviest blow the Sicilian organization had ever taken from the law. Of the hundreds of defendants, 344 were convicted. The sentences handed down added up to a staggering total. Thousands of years of prison time shared among the guilty. And at the very top, 19 of the most important bosses and killers were sentenced to prison for life. Among those given the heaviest sentences were the leaders the case had reached through the theorem, including men tried in their absence, the fugitive Riina among them. For the first time, a court had not only convicted foot soldiers, but had reached up the structure and held the leadership responsible. The importance of this went far beyond the individual sentences. The Maxi trial did something no previous effort had managed. It established, in the judgment of a court, that Cosa Nostra existed as the single organized body Buscetta had described. The century of comfortable denial, the insistence that the Mafia was only a vague cultural attitude rather than a structured criminal corporation, was over as a legal matter. The organization had been named, mapped, and convicted as exactly what it was. The men in the cages were not unconnected criminals who happened to share a background. They were members of one thing, and that one thing had now been judged. The proof that had lived only in Buscetta's words and Falcone's documents had become a verdict. It is worth pausing on what this meant for the ordinary people of Sicily, the ones described earlier, who had learned through fear to look away and say nothing. For generations, the organization had presented itself as permanent, as unbeatable, as a part of the natural order that no one could ever challenge and survive. The Maxi trial cracked that image. Here were the bosses, in cages, convicted, sentenced, beaten in open court by the state. It did not end the organization, and no one sensible believed it had. But it proved that the organization could be hurt, that the silence could be broken, that the law could reach even the men at the top. For people who had spent their whole lives being told that resistance was pointless, that was a profound and dangerous idea. Dangerous above all to the organization itself, which depended on the belief that it could never be beaten. But a conviction in the first round of an Italian trial was not the end of the road, and everyone involved knew it. Under the system, the defendants had the right to appeal, and beyond the appeal lay the highest court in the land, the Court of Cassation, which would have the final say on whether the convictions stood or fell. For the organization, this was the real hope. The bosses had powerful friends, deep pockets, and long experience of cases that fell apart on their way up through the higher courts. The expectation in the cages, and the fear among the magistrates who had built the case, was that the Maxi trial verdicts might be quietly unraveled at the top, the sentences cut down or thrown out, the whole enormous effort hollowed out by the very system that had produced it. For years, the question hung in the air. Would the convictions survive all the way to the top, or would the organization's reach into the higher courts save the bosses one more time? The answer came on the 30th of January 1992, and it was not the answer the organization had been counting on. The Court of Cassation, the highest court in Italy, upheld the convictions. The life sentences for the bosses stood. The Maxi trial had not been a temporary embarrassment to be undone on appeal. It was final. For the men who ran the organization, and above all for Salvatore Riina, this was a catastrophe that no amount of money or influence had been able to prevent. The state had reached all the way to the top, named the organization, convicted its leaders, and now made it permanent. The beast had built his power on the belief that he and his men were beyond the reach of the law, and that belief had just been proven false in the most public way imaginable. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A man like Riina did not absorb a defeat like that and quietly accept it. The confirmation of the sentences in January 1992 did not make the organization back down. It enraged the leadership, and it set in motion a decision that would turn the organization's fury away from rival criminals and informers and aim it directly at the heart of the state, at the very people who had made the Maxi trial happen. The magistrate who had listened to Buscetta, who had built the case, who had become the face of the state's victory, was about to become the organization's most important target. Section 6. Capaci. To understand the size of what happened on the 23rd of May 1992, it helps to know what kind of man Giovanni Falcone had become by then, and how alone he often was, even as he became famous. Falcone was, by this point, the most recognizable enemy the organization had. His face was known across Italy. His work had built the Maxi trial, and the Maxi trial had just been confirmed at the highest court in the land a few months earlier. To the public, he was the symbol of the fight against the organization, the man who had finally made the bosses pay. But fame did not mean safety, and it did not always mean support. Falcone had spent years dealing with a chronic shortage of resources, with colleagues who envied or distrusted him, and with a system that often seemed to put obstacles in his path rather than clear them. He had even been passed over for a senior anti-mafia post that many believed should have been his. He carried on anyway, by this stage working in Rome at the Ministry of Justice, where he was trying to build stronger national tools against the organization, while still returning to Sicily on weekends. It was that routine, the weekend return to Sicily, that the organization studied and turned into a weapon. Falcone would fly from Rome into the airport near Palermo, and from the airport, he would travel by road into the city along a particular stretch of motorway. This was a predictable pattern, and predictability is exactly what an organization hunting a man needs. The decision to end Falcone had come from the very top, from Salvatore Riina, in the wake of the Maxi trial sentences being made final. Riina did not want a quiet killing. Riina wanted a demonstration, a display of power so enormous that it would announce to the entire country that the organization could strike down even the state's greatest champion, in Sicily, in spectacular fashion. The job of carrying it out was given to a member named Giovanni Brusca, a figure from a family allied with the Corleonesi, who would become one of the most notorious names in the whole story. The plan that Brusca and the others put together was not a shooting. It was something closer to an act of war. The chosen spot was a section of the motorway near a town called Capaci, between the airport and Palermo. There, the attackers identified a drainage channel, a culvert, running underneath the road. Into that channel, they packed an enormous quantity of explosives, a load measured in hundreds of kilograms, packed into containers, and placed directly beneath the surface of the motorway. The intention was not to damage a car. The intention was to destroy a stretch of road and everything on it. The preparation was careful and patient. The attackers carried out test runs to get the timing right, working out the exact moment to trigger the blast against a fast-moving target, even using flashes of light to simulate the passing of a speeding car so they could rehearse the split-second decision. Nothing about this was improvised. It was engineered. On the afternoon of the 23rd of May, 1992, Falcone flew into Sicily, as he often did on a weekend. He was traveling with his wife, Francesca Morvillo, who was herself a magistrate, and with a security escort. The convoy was made up of several cars. In one of them rode 3 police officers of the escort, Vito Schifani, Rocco DiCillo, and Antonio Montanaro. Falcone, as it happened, was at the wheel of his own car that day, with his wife beside him. As the convoy moved along the motorway toward Palermo, the attackers were in position. A lookout tracked the approach of the cars and relayed the moment. Brusca was stationed on high ground overlooking the road, watching, with the trigger in hand. At the moment the convoy passed over the culvert, Brusca set off the explosives. The blast was almost beyond comprehension. It tore the motorway apart, opening a huge crater in the road and hurling vehicles through the air. The car carrying the 3 escort officers took the full force of the explosion and was thrown from the road. Vito Schifani, Rocco DiCillo, and Antonio Montanaro were killed. The car carrying Falcone and his wife was thrown forward into the wall of debris. The force of it was so great that it registered on instruments that monitor earthquakes, picked up by equipment watching for tremors from the volcano on the far side of the island. A bomb meant to kill 1 man had shaken the ground like a natural disaster. Giovanni Falcone and Francesca Morvillo did not survive. The man who had built the Maxi trial, who had listened to Buscetta and written down the secret structure of the organization, who had become the face of the state's fight, was gone, along with his wife and 3 officers who had been protecting him. The most important enemy the organization had was dead, killed in exactly the spectacular, public, unmistakable way that Ririna had wanted. The message Ririna intended to send had been sent. The organization could reach anyone. The reaction across Italy was not what the organization expected, and this is one of the most important turns in the entire story. Ririna seems to have believed that a show of overwhelming force would frighten the state into backing down, would prove that resistance was hopeless, would restore the old certainty that the organization could never be beaten. It did the opposite. The killing of Falcone did not produce silence and submission. It produced shock, grief, and a wave of public fury that had no real precedent. The funerals were broadcast live on national television, and the country watched. Regular programming was suspended. Parliament declared a day of mourning. Thousands gathered. And the anger was aimed not only at the organization but at a state and a political class that many ordinary people felt had failed to protect a man everyone knew had been a target for years. Something shifted in the public mood that day, a sense that this could not be allowed to stand, that the line had been crossed in a way that demanded a response rather than a retreat. There is a detail from the aftermath of the killing that says more about the true character of the organization than any film ever has, and it goes back to the man at the top. According to the later account of a member who turned against the organization, when news of the successful attack reached the leadership, Ririna celebrated. There was, the account says, a toast. The beast who had ordered the destruction of a man on a public motorway, killing his wife and 3 officers along with him, marked the achievement by raising a glass. Set that against the picture the films love to paint, the dignified Don who takes no pleasure in violence and acts only out of grim necessity. The reality was a leader celebrating the spectacular killing of a public servant with a drink, treating mass murder as a victory to be enjoyed. The honor was never real. The celebration was. It is worth taking a moment to absorb how completely this kind of crime breaks the boundaries that the screen version of the Mafia respects. The American story dramatized on film stays, for the most part, inside the underworld. Criminals prey on criminals. Rivals settle scores. The violence, however ugly, mostly stays among people who chose that life. What happened at Capaci was a different category of act entirely. This was an organization using a weapon of mass destruction on a public road to assassinate a senior officer of the state, his wife, and his bodyguards, as a deliberate public statement. This was not the underworld settling its own affairs. This was a private army declaring war on the country itself. There is no scene in the famous films that comes close, because the real thing went somewhere the stories never dared to go. The investigation that followed in the months and years afterward slowly pieced together exactly how the attack had been carried out and who had been involved, and the way it came apart again shows the deep crack that ran through the organization. In the period after the bombing, investigators managed to track and listen in on several of the men connected to the attack, picking up references to what had been done. One of those men, after being arrested, took his own life in his cell. Others, faced with capture, made the same choice Buscetta had made before them. They decided to cooperate. Among those who eventually turned and told the authorities the inner details of the Capaci attack was Giovanni Brusca himself, the man who had pressed the trigger, captured years later in 1996. Another who turned was a member of the escort to the attack, named Santino Di Matteo, and his decision to talk would lead to one of the most horrifying acts of revenge in the whole history of the organization, an act that will be examined in detail in a later section. Brusca, once he began cooperating, described the attack from the inside, including the chilling fact that he had watched Falcone's convoy approach through binoculars and triggered the blast at the chosen moment by remote control. Brusca was a man who, by his own later admission, had been involved in an almost unimaginable number of killings, with estimates running between 100 and 200 lives. The detail of him calmly watching through binoculars and pressing a button to destroy a stretch of motorway full of people captures the cold, technical, utterly remorseless nature of the violence the organization had perfected. This was killing reduced to engineering, carried out by men who felt nothing they were willing to admit. The legal consequences stretched out across decades and reached even those who had given the orders or helped plan it from behind the scenes. Over the years, many of the people involved in the Capaci attack were convicted and sentenced, including to life imprisonment. The responsibility was traced not only to the hands that built and triggered the bomb, but to the leadership that had ordered it. Among those eventually held responsible as one of the instigators was Matteo Messina Denaro, a younger Corleonese figure who would go on to become one of the longest hunted fugitives in the world, and whose name will return later in this story. The state, in the end, did reach most of the people behind Capaci, even if it took many years, and even if some survivors of that day have always insisted that not every question about who truly stood behind the attack was ever fully answered. But the most important consequence of Capaci was not any single conviction. It was the change in the country. The killing of Falcone, meant to prove the organization's invincibility, instead became the moment that began the organization's decline. The wave of public anger gave the state the backing it needed to respond with a force it had not shown before. The bombing made it impossible for the political class to keep treating the organization as a manageable nuisance or a distant problem. It turned a fight that had been carried mostly by a small number of brave magistrates and officers into something the whole nation now demanded. Riina had wanted to demonstrate power. What the demonstration actually proved, in the end, was that the organization had finally gone too far, and that going too far had a cost. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The grief of those weeks was made almost unbearable by what came next, because the organization was not finished. Falcone had a closest friend and colleague, another magistrate from the same Palermo neighborhood, a man who had worked beside him through the whole long fight, who had shared the same dangers, and who now stepped into the role of the state's most important target. He knew, with terrible clarity, that he was next, and he was given less than 2 months. Section 7. 57 days. Paolo Borsellino and Giovanni Falcone had known each other almost their whole lives. The two had grown up in the same part of Palermo, a working-class quarter, where some of the boys they played with as children would later grow up to become members of the very organization the two men would spend their adult lives fighting. They had kicked a ball around the same square as boys. They had studied law, and they had both, in the end, chosen to become prosecuting magistrates and to turn their knowledge against the organization that had shaped the world around them. By the time of the Maxi trial, the two were the central figures of the anti-mafia pool, the small team of magistrates who had pooled their dangerous knowledge so that no single death could destroy a case. They were not just colleagues, they were close friends, bound by shared work, shared danger, and a shared understanding of exactly what they were risking. Borsellino was, in temperament, somewhat different from Falcone. Where Falcone could seem reserved and methodical, Borsellino was known as a warmer, more openly emotional man, a heavy smoker, religious, devoted to his family. But the two shared the same iron commitment to the work and the same clear-eyed awareness of how it was likely to end. When Falcone was killed at Capaci, Borsellino lost not only a colleague, but the friend he had stood beside through the whole long fight. And in the days that followed, it became clear to everyone, and above all to Borsellino himself, that he was now the most important target the organization had. The logic was brutally simple. Falcone and Borsellino had been the two faces of the Maxi trial. With one gone, the other was next. Borsellino did not pretend otherwise. In the weeks after Capaci, he spoke openly, to colleagues and in public, like a man who knew his time was short. He described himself in terms that left no room for comfort, the words of someone who understood he had been marked for death and did not expect the state to save him. He worked at a furious pace in those weeks, as if trying to get as much done as possible before the inevitable arrived. There are accounts of him in deep distress during this period, of a man carrying an unbearable weight, at one point seen so agitated that he was holding 2 lit cigarettes at the same time without noticing. Something was eating at him in those final weeks, beyond the ordinary fear of a man who knows he is hunted. He had become aware of things that disturbed him deeply, and the full nature of what he knew, and whether it played a part in how quickly he was killed, remains one of the darkest unresolved questions in the entire story. The organization did not make him wait long. Just 57 days after the bomb at Capaci tore apart the motorway and killed Falcone, the organization struck again. On the 19th of July 1992, Borsellino went, as he often did on a Sunday, to visit his mother at her apartment in Palermo, on a street called Via D'Amelio. He arrived with his security escort in the late afternoon. Waiting on that street, parked among the ordinary cars of an ordinary residential block, was a small car packed with explosives, a load of around 90 to 100 kilograms of high explosive. As Borsellino walked from his car toward the entrance of his mother's building, the device was triggered by remote control. The explosion devastated the street. It killed Paolo Borsellino. It also killed 5 members of his police escort, and their names belong in this account just as much as his. They were Agostino Catalano, Walter Cosina, Vincenzo Limuli, Claudio Traina, and Emanuela Loi. Emanuela Loi holds a particular and painful place in this history. She was the first woman in Italy to serve as part of this kind of police escort, and she became the first Italian policewoman to be killed in the line of duty. 5 officers and the magistrate they were protecting, gone in an instant on a quiet Sunday afternoon, outside the home of an elderly woman. One officer who had been in the 3rd car of the escort, still parking when the blast came, survived. He described the scene afterward in terms of pure horror, a street turned into an inferno. In the space of 57 days, the organization had killed the 2 magistrates who, more than anyone else, had built the case that put its bosses behind bars for life. The 2 boyhood friends from the same Palermo neighborhood, who had fought side by side and known exactly how it was likely to end, were both dead, killed by the same organization, by the same method, within 2 months of each other. For the organization, it must have seemed like total victory, the elimination of its 2 greatest enemies in a single devastating season. But just as with Capaci, the killing did not produce the submission Riina was counting on. It deepened the public fury, hardened the national resolve, and pushed the state toward the crackdown that would eventually begin to break the organization apart. There is a detail about the Via D'Amelio attack that turns an already terrible crime into something even darker, and it concerns what disappeared from the scene in the moments after the blast. Borsellino was known to carry a particular item with him at all times, a red diary or notebook, which people came to call the Agenda Rossa, the Red Agenda. In it, he wrote down the details of his investigations, the things he was learning, the threads he was following. In the period before his death, he had been deeply troubled and had been pursuing matters he considered extremely sensitive. After the explosion, in the chaos and the smoke, that red notebook vanished. It was never recovered. Someone, in the moments after the bomb went off, appears to have taken it. The disappearance of the notebook has haunted the case ever since, because it suggests that whatever Borsellino had written down, whatever he had come to know in his final weeks, was something that certain people very much did not want anyone else to read. The question of what was in that notebook connects to the deepest mystery of Borsellino's death. In his last weeks, Borsellino had become aware of the possibility that secret contacts were taking place between elements of the state and the organization, a kind of behind-the-scenes bargaining. The idea, broadly, was that as the organization waged its campaign of bombings, certain figures may have been exploring an arrangement to calm the violence in exchange for concessions. Whether such contacts truly shaped his murder has been the subject of investigations and trials for decades and remains legally contested and unproven in its fullest form, so it must be treated as an open and disputed question rather than an established fact. But what is beyond dispute is that Borsellino, in his final days, was a man disturbed by something he had learned, that he carried a notebook recording his thoughts, and that the notebook was taken from the scene of his death and never seen again. Those facts alone are enough to mark this as something stranger and more troubling than a simple gangland killing. And then there is the part of the Via D'Amelio story that may be the most disturbing of all, because it shows the harm reaching beyond the organization and into the state's own house. The investigation into Borsellino's murder went badly wrong, and not by accident. In the years after the bombing, the authorities built a case based heavily on the testimony of a man named Vincenzo Scarantino, a small-time criminal who claimed knowledge of the attack. On the strength of what he said, a number of men were convicted and sent to prison for their supposed roles in the killing, some of them given life sentences. There was only one problem: Scarantino's account was false. He was, in effect, a fabricated witness, and the men convicted on his word were innocent of the crime. This was not a simple mistake. Later investigations established that Scarantino had been manipulated and pressured into giving false testimony, and that the whole false trail had been constructed and pushed forward by people within the investigative machinery itself. A group of police investigators was at the center of it. The result was that for years the official version of how Borsellino died was a lie that protected the truth by burying it under false convictions of innocent people. It took the eventual cooperation of a genuine member of the organization, a man named Gaspare Spatuzza, who began telling the truth years later, to start unraveling the fabrication and reveal that the official story had been built on a lie. The Italian courts, in the long series of trials that followed over the years, eventually confronted what had happened, and the language used to describe it was extraordinary. The deception around the Borsellino investigation came to be described, in connection with the later trial that finally exposed it, as one of the most serious misdirections in the history of Italian justice. Innocent men had been imprisoned, the real truth had been delayed for many years, and the question of exactly who, inside the state, had an interest in steering the investigation away from the truth, and why, has never been fully and satisfyingly answered. Some of the officials connected to the false trail were later put on trial themselves, though the legal outcomes were tangled and incomplete, with the passage of time and the rules on time limits playing their part in how those cases ended. Step back and consider what this means against the comfortable image of the mafia on the screen. In the films, the line between the criminals and the law is usually clear. There are the gangsters, and there are the cops and the prosecutors who chase them, and whatever corruption exists is a matter of a few bad individuals taking bribes. The reality of Via D'Amelio is far murkier and far more frightening. Here was a case in which a magistrate was killed by a bomb. His investigative notebook vanished from the scene, and then the official investigation into his death was deliberately twisted, with innocent men convicted and the truth buried for years through the actions of people inside the state's own apparatus. This is not the clean conflict of cops and criminals. It is something darker, a world in which the boundaries between the organization and parts of the state itself became blurred, where the people meant to find the truth instead helped hide it. No film built on the romance of honor among thieves has ever shown anything this bleak, because the romance depends on the line being clear, and here the line dissolved. Borsellino's family, in the years that followed, refused to let his death be smoothed over or used for show. They became, in their grief, relentless seekers of the truth, demanding answers about why he was killed, what was in the missing notebook, and who had steered the investigation off course. In one striking act of protest, the family chose to stay away from official commemorations of the massacre, unwilling to stand alongside the very institutions they felt had failed to deliver the full truth about his death. Their stance is its own kind of testimony. A family that lost a father and a husband to the organization, and then watched the search for justice be poisoned from within, decided that the worst response would be to pretend the matter was settled when it was not. Their refusal to let go is one of the reasons the fabrication was eventually exposed at all. The deaths of Falcone and Borsellino, only 57 days apart, mark the highest point of the organization's war on the state, the moment it reached furthest and struck hardest. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously, but they also mark the beginning of the end, because the scale of the horror finally broke something loose in the country. The state, pushed by a furious and grieving public, launched the kind of sustained crackdown it had never managed before. And the first and greatest prize of that crackdown was the man who had ordered it all, the fugitive who had been hiding in plain sight for more than 2 decades, the beast from the hills who had built his power on the belief that he could never be caught. The hunt for Salvatore Riina was about to reach its end. Section 8. Catching the Beast. The most remarkable fact about Salvatore Riina's capture is how long it had been impossible. By the start of 1993, Riina had been a fugitive for around 23 years. He had gone into hiding at the end of the 1960s to avoid a courtroom, and he had simply never come out. Across more than 2 decades, he had risen from a hill town enforcer to the supreme boss of the entire Sicilian organization, ordered the slaughter that wiped out the old Palermo families, and directed the bombings that killed Falcone and Borsellino, all while officially being a man the state could not find. He was one of the most wanted criminals in the world, and yet for 23 years he had lived, by all accounts, much of that time not in some distant foreign hideout, but in and around Palermo itself, in the very city the authorities were supposedly scouring for him. That single fact tells a story all by itself. A man does not stay hidden for 23 years in his own home region through luck alone. Riina stayed free because the organization around him was powerful enough, and the silence surrounding him was deep enough to keep him invisible. He reportedly lived a relatively ordinary domestic life during parts of his time on the run, with a family, moving between safe locations, protected by a network of members, and by the terror that kept ordinary people from ever breathing a word. The long invisibility of Riina was not a failure of effort by every single person in the state. It was a measure of how completely the organization had woven itself into the fabric of the place, how many people either served it or feared it too much to speak. For 23 years, the beast hid in plain sight, and the plain sight was the point. What changed was everything that had happened in the months before. The killings of Falcone and Borsellino had not frightened the country into submission, as Riina had expected. They had enraged it. The funerals broadcast to a grieving nation. The public fury aimed at both the organization and the politicians who had tolerated it for so long. The sense that an unforgivable line had been crossed, all of it, created a pressure on the state that had never existed before. After Borsellino's death in particular, the government moved with a new seriousness, deploying additional forces and throwing real weight behind the hunt for the organization's leadership. The same overwhelming violence that Riina had used as a weapon had finally made him the most hunted man in Italy, in a country that, for the first time, truly wanted him caught. Riina was arrested on the 15th of January 1993 in Palermo. After 23 years as a ghost, the beast was finally in the hands of the state. The capture was carried out by a specialized unit of the Carabinieri who had been closing in on his movements. The end, when it came, was almost anticlimactic for a man of such monstrous reputation. There was no shootout, no last stand. The most feared boss in the history of the Sicilian organization was simply stopped and taken into custody. An aging man pulled out of the ordinary traffic of the city he had terrorized for decades. The circumstances of how the authorities finally located him became, however, the subject of lasting controversy, and that controversy is part of the larger murk that surrounds this whole period. The capture relied in part on information that helped lead the authorities to Riina, and questions later arose about what exactly happened in the immediate aftermath of his arrest, particularly concerning the hideout where he had been living. In the period after Riina was taken, his hiding place was not immediately searched and secured in the way one might expect for the lair of the most important criminal in the country. There was a delay, and during that delay the location was emptied of its contents. This failure to immediately secure and search the hideout has been picked over for years, because it raises the disturbing possibility that evidence, perhaps including documents that might have revealed the organization's connections to figures outside it, was allowed to disappear. One of the men involved in the events of this period, the hitman Giovanni Brusca, later offered an account, after he himself was captured and began cooperating, that added to the unease. Brusca suggested that Riina's capture may have come about through a kind of arrangement, a secret understanding involving figures inside and outside the organization, with some within the organization willing to let Riina fall in order to end the era of constant, reckless violence he represented. It must be stressed that this is a contested account, the claim of a mass killer with his own reasons to shape the story, and it has never been established as proven fact. But it fits into a pattern that runs through this whole chapter of the history, a pattern in which the clean version of events, the simple story of brave investigators catching a criminal, keeps dissolving into something murkier, something involving hidden contacts and unanswered questions about what the state knew and what it allowed. Whatever the exact truth of how he was found, the consequence of Riina's capture was enormous. The man who had built his entire reign on the belief that he was beyond the reach of the law was now in a cell, and he would never leave one again. Over the years that followed, Riina was convicted of an almost endless list of crimes and sentenced to life imprisonment many times over, the sentences piling up as case after case reached its conclusion. He was held under a strict prison regime designed specifically for the bosses of the organization, a regime built to cut a jailed leader off from the outside world and prevent him from continuing to give orders from behind bars. The supreme boss, the beast from Corleone, spent the rest of his life locked away, his power broken, his freedom gone for good. He died in custody in November 2017, still a prisoner, still serving the sentences that had finally caught up with him. The strict prison regime he was held under deserves a moment of explanation, because it was one of the state's most important weapons, and it grew directly out of the horrors of this period. The organization had always relied on the ability of its imprisoned bosses to keep running things from inside, passing messages, giving orders, maintaining control even while officially locked up. In response, the state developed a tough regime of isolation for the most dangerous members, restricting their contact with the outside world, limiting visits and communications, and aiming to truly cut the jailed leadership off from the organization outside. This regime became one of the things the organization hated and feared most, precisely because it worked, and it would later become one of the bargaining chips in the murky behind-the-scenes contacts that have shadowed this whole story. Riina's capture was a genuine turning point, the single most important arrest in the history of the fight against the organization. But it did not mean the organization was finished, and it did not mean the violence stopped. In fact, in the immediate aftermath of losing their supreme leader, the organization, or a faction of it, responded not by going quiet, but by lashing out again, carrying the campaign of bombings beyond Sicily and onto the Italian mainland. In 1993, a series of explosions struck targets in major Italian cities, away from the organization's home ground, hitting cultural and public sites and killing and injuring ordinary people who had nothing whatsoever to do with the conflict. This was the organization trying to maintain its strategy of terror, trying to pressure the state through fear even after the loss of Riina, attacking the country itself in places far from Palermo. These mainland bombings are important because they show how completely the organization had abandoned any pretense of being a traditional crime group confined to its own world. Attacking cultural sites and public places in cities far from Sicily, killing random members of the public, was an act of terrorism aimed at an entire nation. It was the same logic that had driven Capaci and Via D'Amelio, the belief that enough spectacular violence could bend the state to the organization's will. And once again, it failed in the same way. Rather than forcing the state to back down, the continued violence only confirmed that the organization was an enemy that had to be defeated rather than tolerated, and the crackdown continued. With Riina gone, leadership of what remained of the Corleonesi passed to his old partner from the very beginning, Bernardo Provenzano, the quiet one, the man nicknamed the Tractor in the early days, and known later for his patient, managerial style. Provenzano represented a different approach from Riina's. Where Riina had ruled through spectacular, headline-grabbing violence, Provenzano favored a strategy of submersion, of lowering the organization's profile, of avoiding the kind of attacks that brought the full weight of the state down on everyone. Under Provenzano, the surviving organization tried to become quieter, less visible, returning to the older business of extortion and infiltration, rather than open war with the country. Provenzano himself became a fugitive in the classic mold, vanishing for decades, hunted, communicating through small handwritten notes passed by hand to avoid detection, until he too was finally captured in 2006 after more than 40 years on the run, and like Riina, spent his remaining years in prison until his death. The capture of Riina, and later of Provenzano, and the breaking of the open war against the state mark the close of the most violent chapter in the organization's modern history. The bosses who had turned the organization into a private army at war with the country were, one by one, taken off the board and locked away for the rest of their lives. The strict prison regime, the wave of members who chose to cooperate, the public fury that no longer allowed the organization to be ignored, all of it combined to break the era of Riina's terror. The organization did not vanish. It adapted, went quieter, shifted back toward the slower work of money and influence. But it would never again hold the kind of open, terrifying power it had wielded at its peak, and it would never again be able to believe that its bosses were beyond the reach of the law. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Yet for all the importance of catching the beast, the capture of Riina did not undo the cruelty that his methods had unleashed, and one of the most monstrous acts in the entire history of the organization was, at the very moment of his arrest, still unfolding. It had begun as revenge against a member who had dared to cooperate after Capaci, and it would drag on for hundreds of days, reaching its end well after Riina himself was already in a cell. It was an act so far beyond any boundary that even hardened members would later struggle to speak of it, and it was carried out against someone who had done nothing at all except be born to the wrong father. Section 9. The Boy. To understand the worst thing the organization ever did, it helps to go back to one of the men from the Capaci section, the police escort to the attack, who chose to cooperate. His name was Santino Di Matteo, and he had been a member of the organization, involved in the world of the Corleonesi, and he had taken part in the operation that ended Falcone's life on the motorway. After being arrested in 1993, Di Matteo made the decision that the organization considered the ultimate betrayal. He became one of the first of those involved in the Capaci attack to start talking, telling the authorities the inner workings of how the bombing had been carried out, who had built it, who had placed the explosives, who had triggered the blast. His testimony was valuable precisely because he had been on the inside of one of the organization's most spectacular crimes. The organization's response to this betrayal was not aimed at Santino Di Matteo himself. It was aimed at his son. Di Matteo had a boy named Giuseppe, who was 12 years old. The plan, ordered by figures at the top of the Corleonesi, including Giovanni Brusca and others, was to kidnap the child and use him as a tool to force the father to take back what he had told the authorities, to retract his testimony and undo the damage. A child was to be seized and held hostage, his life used as leverage to silence a man who had dared to speak. This was the organization that films dress up as a brotherhood of honor, and what it chose to do was take a 12-year-old boy. The kidnapping took place on the 23rd of November 1993. The way it was carried out added a particular cruelty to an already monstrous act. The men who came for Giuseppe disguised themselves as police officers. They told the boy that they were taking him to see his father, who was at that time being held under protection. A child, told that he was being brought to his dad, went with the men who he believed were there to help him. Instead, he was taken into captivity. The trust of a 12-year-old, the simple hope of seeing his father, was used as the bait to lure him into the hands of the people who would end his life. What followed is almost unbearable to set down, but it is the truth, and the truth is the entire point of this account. Giuseppe Di Matteo was held prisoner for a very long time, a period that stretched on for hundreds upon hundreds of days. He was kept in harsh conditions, moved between hiding places, held in captivity by the organization, while his father was pressured to undo his cooperation. During this time, the captors sent the father proof of what they held, images of his imprisoned son, as part of the campaign to break his will. A father who had chosen to tell the truth was made to look at evidence of his child's suffering in the hands of the people he had betrayed, and was told, in effect, that the suffering would only stop if he took his words back. Santino Di Matteo was caught in an impossible position that no person should ever face. To save his son, he was being asked to retract testimony about one of the most serious crimes in the country's history, to protect the very organization that was holding his child. He did, under this unimaginable pressure, attempt to waver and pull back from his cooperation, desperate to save the boy. But the organization did not honor even the terrible bargain it had implied. The captivity dragged on. Months passed, and then more months. The boy held the entire time, his life used as a bargaining chip in a negotiation that was never going to end the way a father prayed it would. The captivity lasted around 779 days. To put that into terms a person can feel, that is more than 2 years. A boy taken at 12 was held prisoner by the organization for over 2 years of his short life, more than 700 days of being a captive, of being moved and hidden and used, of being a child in the hands of men who treated his existence as a tool. And at the end of those 779 days, in January 1996, the order was given to end his life. The boy was killed. He was, by the accounts that later emerged, so weakened by the long ordeal that he could offer no resistance at all. And then, in keeping with the method the organization had perfected during the years of slaughter, his body was destroyed in acid so that nothing would remain. The words used to give the final order have been reported from the later testimony of those involved, and they are among the coldest words in this entire history. The instruction to end the child's life was phrased as a command to get rid of the puppy, a human boy, held for over 2 years, reduced in the language of his killers to an animal to be disposed of. There is no version of honor, no code, no tradition, that can survive being set next to that sentence. The films built their fortunes on the idea that these were men with rules, men who would never touch a child, men bound by something deeper than mere criminality. The real order, in the real history, was to get rid of the puppy. That is what the honor was actually worth. It is important to understand that this was not the act of a single deranged individual. The kidnapping and killing of Giuseppe Di Matteo was an organizational decision, ordered and carried out by significant figures in the Corleonese structure, including Giovanni Brusca, the same man who had triggered the bomb at Capaci. It was a deliberate strategy, chosen by the leadership as a way to deal with the growing problem of members who cooperated with the authorities. The logic behind it was as cold as the order itself. If cooperating with the state meant your innocent child could be taken, held, and killed, then perhaps fewer members would dare to cooperate. The boy's life was spent as a message, a warning to every other member who might be thinking of telling the truth. The organization was willing to torture and kill a child for the sake of intimidation. The timing of the crime makes it even more striking, because it shows that the worst of the cruelty continued, even as the organization's power was being broken. Giuseppe was kidnapped in late 1993, which was after Riina had already been captured in January of that year. The boy was held through 1994 and 1995, and was killed at the beginning of 1996. In other words, the supreme boss whose methods had created this culture of total ruthlessness was already sitting in a prison cell for most of the time the child was held, and the monstrous act went forward regardless. The machinery of cruelty that Riina had built did not need him to be free in order to keep grinding. It had become the organization's way of operating, with or without the beast himself at liberty. There is a moment from the later legal proceedings that captures the depth of what was done, when the father and one of the men responsible for his son's fate came face to face in a courtroom. The grief and rage of a parent who had lost his child to this act broke through in a way that needs no embellishment. Santino Di Matteo, confronting the man connected to his son's killing, made clear in the rawest possible terms that there could be no forgiveness, no peace, nothing but a father's bottomless fury at what had been taken from him. The encounter had to be controlled by the court. It is the sound of a human being who has been hollowed out by a loss that no apology and no sentence could ever begin to repair. The men responsible for the kidnapping and killing of Giuseppe Di Matteo were, over the years, identified, tried, and convicted, as more members cooperated and the full story came out. Among those involved was Giovanni Brusca, who, after his own capture in 1996, became a cooperating witness and admitted to a vast number of crimes across his life as one of the organization's most prolific killers. Brusca's eventual cooperation is itself one of the most uncomfortable threads in the whole story, because the system that encourages members to turn against the organization is built on offering them reduced sentences in exchange for the truth they provide. Brusca, a man involved in an almost unimaginable number of killings, including the triggering of the Capaci bomb and a role in the fate of the Di Matteo boy, ultimately received the benefits of that system. Many years later, having served his reduced sentence, he was released, a decision that caused deep public anger and reopened the wounds of the families of his many victims. The widow of one of the officers killed at Capaci spoke bitterly of the pain of seeing the man who had destroyed her family walk free. This raises one of the genuinely hard questions that runs underneath the whole fight against the organization, a question the films never have to deal with. The cooperation of members like Buscetta, like the men who turned after Capaci, like Brusca, was the single most powerful weapon the state ever found against the organization. Their testimony built the Maxi trial, solved the bombings, and exposed crimes like the killing of Giuseppe Di Matteo that might otherwise have stayed hidden forever. But the price of that weapon is that some of the worst people in the entire story, men with dozens or even more than 100 killings behind them, receive reduced sentences and, in some cases, eventually walk out of prison. The state made a calculation that the truth provided by such men was worth more than the full punishment they deserved. It is a defensible calculation, and it worked. But it is not clean, and it leaves families like those of Capaci and Via D'Amelio and the Di Matteo boy living with the knowledge that some of the guilty served far less than their crimes would seem to demand. The killing of Giuseppe Di Matteo stands as the clearest single answer to the question this whole account is built around. The question of why the real story is worse than the polished version on the screen. The films sell a fantasy in which these are men with limits, men whose violence, however brutal, operates within a code that protects the innocent, and especially the young. The reality is a 12-year-old boy lured away by men pretending to help him, held captive for more than 2 years, killed when his father's truth could not be unsaid, and erased in acid, his death ordered with the words, "Get rid of the puppy." There is no romance that survives contact with that fact. There is no honor in it anywhere. It is simply the bottom of what human cruelty can reach, carried out by an organization that the world has somehow been taught to find glamorous. It would be comforting to think that an act this monstrous represented some kind of final limit, a horror so extreme that the organization could go no lower and that the world would never again look at these men with anything but disgust. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And in terms of sheer cruelty, the killing of the boy may indeed mark the lowest point, but the organization did not simply collapse in shame after the era of the bombings and the worst of the killings. It survived. It changed shape. It learned to be quieter and harder to see, and it found new ways to keep its grip on the businesses and communities that had always been its true foundation. The open war was over, but a different kind of struggle, slower and less visible, was only beginning, and ordinary people would continue to pay its price long after the famous bombs had stopped. Section 10. The Ones Who Said No. The whole story up to this point has been told mostly through the powerful, the bosses and the magistrates, the killers and the men who hunted them. But the organization's real victims, across more than a century, were never mostly famous. They were ordinary people, and the organization's true power was never really about bombs and assault weapons. It was about a quieter thing, a daily pressure on shopkeepers and builders and market traders and families, the slow tax of fear that funded everything else. To understand why the organization lasted so long, and why it began, in the end, to lose its grip, the story has to come down from the level of bosses and reach the level of the people who actually had to live alongside it. And to do that, it helps to look at two people who, in very different ways, simply refused. The first is a man named Libero Grassi. Grassi was not a magistrate or a police officer or anyone with power. He was a businessman in Palermo, the owner of a factory that made clothing, employing around 100 workers. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of ordinary target the organization had preyed upon for generations through the protection racket, the system of forcing businesses to pay regular sums simply for the right to keep operating. The demand came to Grassi as it came to so many others, a requirement to hand over money to the organization, with the unspoken understanding that refusal would bring vandalism, fire, or worse. By some estimates, around half of the businesses in Palermo were paying at that time, and in the wider picture, the great majority of Sicilian businesses lived under this same quiet extortion. Paying was simply what you did. It was treated as a cost of doing business, as normal as paying for electricity. Grassi decided he would not pay, and then he did something almost no one in his position had ever dared to do. He made his refusal public. At the start of 1991, he wrote an open letter that was published in a Palermo newspaper. He addressed it, with bitter directness, to the extortionist, and in it he announced to the whole city that he was refusing to hand over the money and denouncing the demand. He did not stop there. He gave the names of the people who had been pressuring him to the authorities, a move that led to several arrests. He went on television. He became, almost overnight, a national figure, a single ordinary businessman who had stood up in public and said no to the organization out loud. What happened next reveals something crucial about how the organization actually maintained its power, and it is not what most people would expect. Grassi was not immediately embraced as a hero by his fellow businessmen. Quite the opposite. He found himself isolated, criticized, and shunned by the very people who should have stood beside him. Other business owners did not rally to his side. Instead, many of them resented him, accusing him of drawing unwanted attention, of damaging the image of the Palermo business community, of making trouble for everyone by refusing to quietly play along. Some customers stopped coming to him, afraid of being associated with a man who had openly defied the organization. The pressure on Grassi came not only from the criminals, but from a whole society that had learned over generations that the safest thing was to keep your head down and pay. He had broken an unwritten rule that everyone else was still following, and they punished him for it with their silence and their distance. This is the mechanism that the films almost never show. The organization's strength was never just its capacity for violence. Its deeper strength was the way it had trained an entire society into quiet cooperation, into the belief that resistance was not only dangerous, but somehow shameful, a selfish act that endangered everyone else. The pressure to conform, to pay, to stay silent, came from neighbors and fellow traders, as much as from the organization itself. Grassi's isolation shows how completely the organization had managed to make its own rules feel like common sense, so that the man who refused to fund criminals was treated as the problem, while the criminals collecting the money were treated as a fact of life to be quietly managed. Fear had been turned into a social habit, and Grassi had violated it. On the 29th of August, 1991, less than a year after his open letter, Libero Grassi was shot and killed near his home in Palermo as he walked to his car in the morning. He was 67 years old. No witnesses came forward, the same wall of silence closing over his death as had closed over so many others. The organization had answered his public defiance in the most direct way it knew, ending the life of an ordinary man whose only crime was to refuse to pay and to say so out loud. The cost of saying no, in that place and time, was death. But the killing of Libero Grassi did not have the effect the organization intended, and in that failure lies the beginning of a real change. His murder shocked the city in a way that the routine violence had stopped doing. Large numbers of people took to the streets in protest. His death, and the public courage that had preceded it, planted something. In the years that followed, his family carried on his stand rather than retreating into silence, and his example became a reference point for a slow shift in how ordinary Sicilians thought about the protection racket. Eventually, his stand helped inspire organized resistance to extortion, movements built on the simple idea he had embodied alone, that a community that pays the organization is a community that has surrendered its dignity, and that the way to break the racket is for businesses and customers together to refuse to take part in it. The lone man who had been shunned became, after his death, a symbol that helped others find the courage to stand together. The second person worth looking at lived a generation earlier and came from a very different place. But his story rhymes with Grassi's in the most important way. His name was Giuseppe Impastato, known to everyone as Peppino. What makes his story remarkable is where he came from. Peppino Impastato was born into a family with ties to the organization, in a town not far from Palermo, in a world where the local boss was a powerful and respected figure, and where Peppino's own father was connected to that world. He grew up inside the very culture this whole account has described, close enough to the organization to see exactly how it worked and what it did, and he turned against it completely. As a young man, Peppino broke with his family's world and devoted himself to opposing the organization in the most public and mocking way he could. He set up a small independent radio station with his friends, and from it, he broadcast a program in which he ridiculed the local boss and the organization openly, turning the men who ruled his town through fear into figures of comedy. This was an extraordinary thing to do. The organization's power depended on being feared and respected, on the silence and deference of the people around it. Peppino refused to give it either. He laughed at it, in public, on the air, and he encouraged others to see it not as something awesome and untouchable, but as something ridiculous and contemptible. He attacked the organization's most important possession, its image, and he did it from inside its own territory. In 1978, Peppino Impastato was killed. His body was placed on a railway line along with explosives, which were then detonated, in an attempt to disguise the killing as an accident or as the death of a man caught making a bomb. At first, that is exactly how the authorities treated it. The initial official line was that Peppino had been a kind of terrorist who had died handling explosives, or that he had taken his own life. The truth, that he had been murdered by the organization to silence his mockery and his activism, was buried under a false story, and his name was stained rather than honored. The people meant to investigate his death instead steered the explanation away from the obvious answer. The recovery of the truth about Peppino's death took decades, and it happened because his family refused to let the lie stand. His mother and his brother fought for years against official indifference and against the stain on his memory, to have his death recognized for what it was, a murder ordered by the organization. It took many years even to get the case properly reopened, and many more before the local boss was finally convicted, near the end of the century, of having ordered the killing. The persistence of one family, refusing to accept the comfortable false story, eventually forced the truth into the open and turned Peppino Impastato from a smeared and forgotten figure into one of the most honored symbols of the resistance to the organization. His story became widely known, and the distance between his family's home and the home of the boss who had him killed, a short walk of about 100 steps, became a famous image of how close ordinary people lived to the power that controlled them. The two stories share a pattern that points to the deepest truth in this entire account. In both cases, an ordinary person stood up against the organization. In both cases, the organization killed them for it. In both cases, the first response of the wider world was not support, but silence, isolation, or even a false story that blamed the victim. And in both cases, it was the refusal of those left behind to accept that silence, the stubborn insistence of families and communities on the truth, that eventually turned a death into something more powerful than the killing had been. The organization could end a life. What it could not do, in the end, was control what that life came to mean, once enough people refused to look away. This is the real reason the organization began to lose its grip, and it is a quieter and more hopeful reason than the dramatic captures of bosses. The bosses were caught and locked away, yes, and the open war was broken, but the organization had survived crackdowns before. What it could not survive in the long run was the slow change in ordinary people, the gradual erosion of the silence and the fear and the sense of helplessness that had always been its true foundation. Every person who refused to pay, every family that demanded the truth about a murdered relative, every community that decided the organization was contemptible rather than untouchable, chipped away at the thing the organization most needed, which was the cooperation of the people it preyed upon. The organization was never really defeated by bombs or trials alone. It was worn down by a society that slowly stopped agreeing to be afraid. It would be wrong, though, to end on the comfortable note that the story is over and the good side simply won. The organization still exists. It did not vanish when its most violent leaders were imprisoned. Instead, it adapted, as it has always adapted, becoming quieter and harder to see, moving away from spectacular violence and back toward the patient business of extortion, of infiltrating legitimate economies, of corrupting where it cannot frighten. The protection racket that killed Libero Grassi never fully disappeared. The pressure on ordinary businesses, the quiet tax of fear, continued in new forms. The organization learned that the open war against the state had been a catastrophic mistake, one that brought down upon it a fury that nearly destroyed it, and it resolved not to make that mistake again. A quieter organization is harder to fight precisely because it gives the public less to be outraged about. The absence of bombs can look like peace when it is really only a change of method. So the honest conclusion of this whole account is not that the monster was slain. It is something more sober and more useful than that. The screen version of the organization, the world of sharp suits and loyalty and honor among men who live by a code, is a costume, and behind the costume is what this account has actually described. An organization born in the gap, left by a broken old order. A hidden structure that denied its own existence for a century. A takeover by men from a hill town who won by breaking every rule the organization claimed to live by. A slaughter that filled the streets of a city with bodies. A war on the state that killed its bravest magistrates with bombs on public roads. An investigation poisoned from within. A child held for more than 2 years and then killed and erased. And, threaded through all of it, ordinary people crushed by a quiet daily fear, a few of whom found the courage to say no and paid for it with their lives. That is why the real story is worse than the famous film, and the word worse has carried a precise meaning all the way through. Not more thrilling, not more stylish, worse. The film is a story with a shape and an ending, a fantasy that lets the audience enjoy the danger from a safe distance and walk out when the lights come up. The real thing had no clean ending and no safe distance. It left real graves across decades, real families that never recovered, real towns held in fear for generations, and a wound in a real country that is still not closed. The men who did all this were not knights with a code. They were the people who looked at a 12-year-old boy and gave the order to get rid of the puppy. Once that is understood, the glamour does not survive. What is left is the truth, and the memory of the ones who refused to be silent, whose names deserve to outlast the names of the bosses who tried to erase them. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.